Hey everybody, we are doing one final wrap up at the end of this year as we have finished 2 years of being in the prophets. That's a really incredible feat, especially if you've been reading all the way from Isaiah all the way to the end of Malachi. It's been a really hard slog because the prophets are not really easy books, but hopefully over this last 2 years, you can see, yeah, the beauty of the prophetic message in these sections of Scripture. But today we want to see how these things really connect us to Jesus. And we're going to end with Malachi chapter 4, which is the very last chapter of the very last book of all of the Old Testament. It's the last prophetic book as well. And as we talked about the last couple weeks, as we talked about Malachi is really about people who have returned to the land, but and they're going through the motions of following God, but their heart's not really in it. And so Malachi ends with this warning and this encouragement, the encouragement to choose God, to live for Him, and receive all His blessings and life in His name, or to reject God, to keep going how they're going, and instead they find themselves missing out. And this is reflected in the last few verses. It says in chapter 4, verse 1, the Lord Almighty says, "Not a root or branch will be left to them when the day of the Lord comes. But for those of you who revere my name, the Sun of Righteousness will rise with healing in its rays, and you will go out and frolic like well-fed calves. Then you will trample on the wicked, their ashes will be under the soles of your feet when I act, says the Lord Almighty." What this is doing, this is really interesting, and why I'm ending with this is actually it connects us directly to Jesus. And you might say, okay, so maybe the Son, like the Son is like the Son, Jesus? Is that what you're talking about? Well, kind of, yeah. But really interesting. Let's jump into one of our maybe well-known New Testament stories about Jesus. You may recall that Jesus was in a crowd one day, and all these people are pressing around him. And this woman who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, that she had some kind of disorder or some kind of disease which made her bleed constantly. And she went to all of these doctors, spent all of this money, but no one could heal her. And she was considered unclean because in that Jewish culture, if you had kind of an open wound like that, or you had bleeding, or probably in this case, you had a menstrual cycle flow, you were considered unclean, and you were supposed to separate yourselves from the rest of the community. But this woman had heard Jesus was coming into town, and she pressed through the crowd, somehow wiggled her way through this giant crowd that was pressing around Jesus, and she reached out and she touches his cloak. And she says to herself, I know who this person is, and if I just touch the hem of his cloak, his robe, I know that I'll be healed. And she does so, and she is healed. And then Jesus stops and he calls her out, and he says, Who touched me? And his disciples kind of look around and like, what do you mean? There's like all these people, there's like hundreds of people crowding around you. Everyone is touching you. What do you mean, who touched you? And Jesus says, I know, I felt power go out of me. And then this woman comes forward and admits she's the one that touches Jesus. And Jesus looks at her, I imagine has this great big smile on her face and says, Woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. She's healed, and Jesus, by doing this, kind of singles her out as saying, look, you are on the outside in the fringes, but because you have trusted in me, you are healed. Not just physically healed, but healed within your relationships in the community. You don't have this blood flow that was separating you and marking you as unclean anymore. You're clean, but also spiritually healed. She is healed because she had this enormous faith in Jesus. So how does this tie to this line in Malachi, and how is it tied to the rest of the prophets? Well, interestingly enough, Jesus, as you are probably aware, is the culmination of the prophetic message. What is the prophetic message? Well, it's a warning and it's an encouragement. The warning is that God's patience is not going to last forever. And for those who are evildoers, who are wicked, who especially harm the most vulnerable, the poor, the fatherless, the widow, God's justice is going to come upon you, because the day of the Lord is at hand. There'll be a day when evil reigns no more. God will return to his people, and everyone will come before the judgment seat of God. And so if you are one of those who stands against God when he comes, you're in trouble. It's not going to end well for you. But if you are on the side of God, that you love him and trust him, even when it has been costly for you to do so, well, you're going to find yourself blessed, counted as one of God's children, welcomed into his kingdom. And this is what the prophetic message is, that God is going to send someone who is going to usher in this day of the Lord, who's going to reveal righteousness and wickedness in people, who's going to separate those who trust in him versus those who don't. And Jesus is the culmination of all these prophetic messages. Throughout the Gospels, we see the Gospel writers, and even in the book of Acts, as people talk about Jesus, that the prophets, especially in Isaiah in particular, mention these prophetic messages from old that were spoken hundreds of years ago to say Jesus is the fulfillment of all these things that God is doing. He is the one that God is sending. He is the one that is going to usher in God's kingdom. He is going to be the one that brings about life and healing and hope and peace. But for those that stand against him, they have the opposite for them. Separation from God, lack of peace, lack of joy. And when that final day comes, the final day of the Lord, they won't stand. And so all the prophets really speak to say God is going to fulfill his word. He is coming again. He is going to send the righteous one, the one who can do what we cannot do for ourselves, because we constantly fail, do wrong, get it wrong, are broken. Yet this one is going to perfectly represent God, his power, his love, his justice, his authority, and he's going to usher in my kingdom. And so cling to me and trust in this one who's going to come. And this is what this woman did in the Gospels. And she picked up on this last verse in Malachi, because remember, at the end of Malachi, we have about 450 years before Jesus comes. And yet, this woman has been holding to this hope and these promises for all of that time. How? By touching the hem of Jesus' cloak? What's that about? Well, the interesting thing is that that word for the edge of his cloak or the edge of his robe is the same word in Hebrew here in Malachi 4 verse 2 that says the Son of Righteousness will come with healing in its rays. So the rays is the same word that can be translated as the very fringe of someone's cloak. It's like in Hebrew customs and kind of attire, there were rabbis that would have these cloaks that would have these little tassels that look like, just, what tassels look like. But people would say they look like the rays of the sun. That's what these tassels are, and they were on the edge of people's cloaks. So it's the same word, healing in his rays, healing in his tassels, the tassels that are at the edge of someone's cloak, a rabbi's cloak. So this woman believes this message, has been holding on to this prophetic truth for, that had happened 450 years ago, and says, and recognizes, Jesus, you are the fulfillment of all of God's promises, all of the prophetic message. You are the one that God is sending. And so I believe you are that Son of Righteousness, that you have healing in your rays or wings or the edge of your cloak, your tassels. And so she reaches out, she grabs the edge of Jesus's cloak, and what happens? She is healed, just like this verse says. And she receives peace and healing and wholeness, and she is welcomed into God's family as one of his children. And that is the whole message of the prophets and how they point us to Jesus. He is that one that has come. He is the one that has healing in his rays and the edge of his cloak. And if we just reach out and touch him, we will experience all of these amazing promises and encouragements that happen in the prophets, that we will be welcomed into God's kingdom. We'll be made his children. We'll be invited into this family where there is peace and love and joy. We're known. Nothing can separate us from the love of God. How good is that? So trust in him, reach out and cling to Jesus. But again, if we don't, if we miss out, then there's not going to be a second chance. And so how the prophets lead us to Jesus, which leads us to now, is to say, are we, like this woman, responding to this message of old and recognizing Jesus as the one that God has sent to fulfill all his promises and bring life to the full? And therefore, are we clinging to him with our whole hearts, believing in him is life and love and hope and peace? Or are we keeping Jesus at arm's length? Do we not really trust that he is good, that he is the one that God sent? Do we look to other things to fulfill us and bring us meaning rather than Jesus? If so, well, that's a life that is devoid of hope and joy and promise. And so as we end all of this message, all of the Old Testament, all of the prophets, and as we look forward to next year, my encouragement to all of you is to cling to Jesus. Listen to this message of old that people have ignored for thousands and thousands of years. But those who have responded to it have experienced life, healing, love, peace, joy, patience, all those things, both now and have the promise of it in eternity when the day of the Lord comes and Jesus comes again. So as we end, this has been a really long and devotional, but I just want to encourage you now, for the remainder of this year, into 2024, the rest of your lives, be like this woman. Cling to Jesus. He is the one who has healing in his rays. I'll leave you with that. Have a great Christmas, a happy new year, and we'll see you in 2024 for more devotionals. See you then. Bye.